Very good morning, and you're very welcome to today's Signpost webinar. Today we'll be discussing sustainable tillage practices as agriculture faces increasing pressure to balance food production with environmental stewardship. Sustainable practices have never been so important. In Ireland, where agriculture plays a significant role in both the economy and our landscape, tillage farming is evolving to meet the challenges of climate change, water quality, and soil health, and of course, biodiversity loss. And today we'll be just exploring innovative tillage techniques that minimize environmental impact while maintaining productivity. And we're delighted to be joined by Shay Phelan, tillage and potatoes crop specialist with Teagasc. Good morning, Shay.
Morning, Mark. How are you?
Very good, very good. You're very welcome to today's webinar. And we're also joined by Cathal Somers, who's going to assist us with questions later on. Cathal?
Yep, great to be here, Mark. And hopefully we're going to have a good chat with Shay and plenty to cover. And just to remind people that we have the Q&A tab there, and put your questions in there. And the more questions you have, the better chat we're going to have in discussion at the end.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cathal. And Shay, so maybe Shay, before we get into your presentation, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing? You're based in the National Crop Research Centre down in Oak Park, is that right?
Yeah, you're right, Mark. I'm based down here in Oak Park. It's a lovely frosty morning here this morning, so it's a real October day. And yeah, I'm responsible for the KT part of crops, if you like. So basically, the research that goes on here in Oak Park, I distill that down myself and the other guys in the team, Michael and Kieran Collins. We distill down the information from the research team and we give it out to our advisors and to farmers. So we're kind of that link, if you like, between research and farmers, if you like.
Very good. So as Cathal said, we are going to be recording today's session and do send us your questions through the Q&A tab. Shay, you might get your slides ready for us there. And to remind everyone that there is a podcast version of the webinar that you can tune into, and handy way to catch up on the series if you're on the move. So that can be accessed on all popular podcast platforms. That's perfect.
See that? Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Shay. We'll chat to you after the presentation. So.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. As Mark said, I'm going to take you through some of the key sustainable tillage practices that tillage farmers are employing at the moment, or some that they're changing into over the last number of years, and that other farmers are changing into, I suppose, as we speak, in terms of trying to reduce down their overall greenhouse gas emissions. So I suppose really just to set the scene, really, I suppose if you look at tillage is probably the smallest part, one of the smaller parts of the overall agricultural system in Ireland. There's about 11,000 jobs directly come from tillage. In the map there, you can see, generally speaking, the main tillage areas there. This is from the National Farm Survey. So you can see the general sort of tillage areas, that kind of East Coast, Midlands East Coast, a little bit in Donegal, a little bit on the fringes or in Connacht and Galway and places like that. And I suppose one of the key things, just a few figures here from the National Farm Survey, one of the key things, I suppose, if you're talking about sustainability, really is the work-life balance here. And you can see, in general, tillage farmers work a lot less than dairy farmers. So and we know that dairy farmers tend to work long hours, whereas tillage farmers tend to work seasonally. So there's peak times like sowing, like harvest, when they tend to work a lot harder. But in general times, there's a lot of downtime. So in a lot of cases, it helps that work-life balance, but it also helps in terms of part-time working as well. So I suppose that's where tillage is at the moment. If you look at the environmental sustainability, and I suppose this is one of the key things about tillage farming and tillage practices in terms of a greenhouse gas emission profile. If you look at that there, you can see that by and large, we are on a per hectare basis a lot better in terms of our greenhouse gas emission profile than any of the other systems. And you can see there we're looking at somewhere around 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. And likewise, when you're looking at the overall output, yes, dairying, the output, when you look at dairying, it's a lot higher, so that reduces down or dilutes the greenhouse gas emissions when you're looking at output. But at the same time, tillage is still the most efficient and less polluting, if you like, of any of the agricultural systems or production systems that we have. So I suppose we're starting from a good point, but that said, we're not at zero, but we can get to zero, and I think that's important. if we adopt a couple of practices. So yeah, we are good, but we've road to go, I suppose, as the fellow says. And one of the key things, I suppose, one of the key metrics, if you look at in terms of how sustainable tillage farmers are, if you look at nitrogen use efficiency, and you can see here compared to the other systems again, and this is something I'll come back to later on in the presentation, is that when we look at how we use nitrogen, we are the tillage sector is by and large the most efficient users of nitrogen. So for every kilo we put out, we're recovering about 60 to 70% of that. So that's a key efficiency factor, if you like, in terms of tillage. One, I suppose, aspect of that, and we're very quick to learn, if you don't use nitrogen efficiently in a tillage system, the crops will let you know very, very quickly. And you'll either lodge crops or you'll have very, very poor crops. So from that point of view, tillage farmers are keenly aware of what they're allowed to use and what's the appropriate amount to use, and when, I suppose, when critically you're allowed, when you should use it. So I suppose from a nitrogen efficiency point of view, they are very good. And again, when you compare us to other parts of the world in terms of grain, if you look at that, we were saying we're producing grain for less than two tons per hectare. If you look at maize coming from the US, you're looking at 4 tons per hectare. Soya, there is a lot lower because obviously you're not putting any nitrogen on that. So it's a bit lower there, okay. But if you look at some South American imports, maize coming from South America is 27 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and soya is 1.92. And that's mainly down to deforestation, that there's ongoing deforestation in those countries. And again, I suppose when you compare it to dairy and beef, we're at 1.18 tons per carbon dioxide equivalent, whereas if you look at dairy and beef, we're at 8.7 tons and beef is at 4.4 tons. So we are quite well ahead of some of the other countries and also some of the other systems. So what are tillage farmers trying to achieve? I suppose, really like a lot of farmers, we're trying to reduce our impact and our emissions on the environment. We're trying to protect soils and the environment. And I suppose, again, what we see on tillage systems, if you abuse the soil or abuse the environment, it will react, and it will tell you very, very quickly at the end of the year when you're trying to harvest crops. We're also trying to improve crop performance, and I think that's something that we are trying to constantly improve, because as challenges become more daunting in terms of the environment, and 2023 into 2024 was a good example of that. When we struggle to get crops into the ground, we need to make sure that crops are more resilient and that they can improve for us. And I suppose one of the key things, and we would have seen it from the farm to fork strategy and also from the CAP reforms, this idea that we need to reduce our plant protection products. So the sustainable use regulation was looking at trying to reduce the use of plant protection products by 50% by 2030. We're probably already there. When in an Irish context, we're probably already there already. So we are ahead of the curve, or ahead of the graph in that sort of scenario. But one thing I suppose that kind of gets lost a little bit in the whole push for sustainability is that this whole idea of financial sustainability. So I think that's something that we kind of forget about from time to time, that in order for farmers to do all the other measures, it has to be financially sustainable as well, because obviously if farmers can't make money on it, well, then they're not going to change. So I suppose to set the scene, this is kind of where we were this time last year, if you like, or certainly in November and January this year. We want to avoid this, and most tillage farmers want to avoid a scenario like that there, where you have no crop, bare soil over the winter, and huge potential for both leakage of nitrates into groundwater, but also surface runoff, as you can see here, in ponding and pooling, surface runoff of pee into local drains and rivers and what have you. So that's a kind of, suppose, to set the scene, we want to avoid that. And sometimes it's unavoidable, but generally that would have been a kind of a normal practice 20, 30 years ago, whereby we would have ploughed soils before the winter to let the weather break them down, and then when you come in the spring, you would work them a lot easier. But again, we know from an environmental point of view, that's not acceptable anymore, and rightly so. So I suppose what I've done here is I've looked at 10 different measures that tillage farmers can do on their farms, and some are doing it, and some are doing some, and some are doing all, in terms of improving their sustainability and reducing their impact. So I suppose the first one that kind of a lot of people look at are cultivation systems. And one of the key things here that has, I suppose, we've changed over the last number of years, are our cultivation systems. So we see a lot more reduced cultivation systems on the go now. And that's just and part of it is environmental sustainability, but also there are other factors as well. So we're from the point of view of workload, so we're able to get across ground quicker. So I suppose when you're looking at reduced cultivation system, yes, once you have land in tillage systems, there isn't a huge loss of carbon, but there is ongoing losses from carbon all the time. The biggest loss, I suppose, is when you come from a grassland scenario and you've a lot of carbon built up in long-term grassland soils. And tillage soils tend to have less carbon and organic matter in them anyway. But nonetheless, if you're ploughing, you're releasing carbon, whereas if you're using reduced cultivation systems, you do have less. And you do disturb the soil less. So that's always a good point as well. So if you're not disturbing the soil, you're not releasing that carbon. And one of the key areas, I suppose, for the kind of explosion of reduced cultivation system worldwide, not just in Ireland over the last 20 or so years, has been this whole area of better moisture retention. So if you think back to the Dust Bowl in the US years ago, that's really where this came from. So some of these systems, yes, they are aimed at those drier climates, but they can also be applied in an Irish context, be it we have a wetter climate. But I suppose that's the key and that's the challenge, that they're not suitable in every year. So sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. In 2024, the last month or so, these systems are working perfectly well. And as you saw from the photograph beforehand, one of the key areas that we're trying to avoid is soil erosion. So if you have bare soil and nothing protecting the soil, you're always at risk of either soil erosion or soil movement. And we certainly would have seen some of that in 2023. One of the key things, I suppose, that a lot of people moving to reduced cultivation system often comment on is less weed control. That, I suppose, is something that you have to be very, very careful about. And if somebody's selling you a system based on less weed control, you want to be very, very careful of that. We've just come out of a project over the last number of years where we've looked at low disturbance systems or reduced cultivation systems, if you like. And one of the key problems in those systems are grass weed control. So if you think like wild oats, like sterile brome, those weeds can get established very, very quickly. And if you don't have a plan in place in a reduced cultivation system, you can run into problems very, very quickly. And over time, we have seen people having to return to the plough based on the fact that they have more weeds. But that's just generally a case that's something that we just have to be careful of. As I mentioned earlier on, one of the key metrics or one of the key reasons why people are moving to these types of systems are as farms get bigger, you can drill crops an awful lot faster. So if you're getting into big farms, you can get across the land very, very quickly. Talking to a farmer yesterday, he's in a low disturbance system. He's able to drill about 200 acres in a day. So that's huge potential and huge capacity that he's built into the system, just because he's in that reduced cultivation system. And obviously, if you're doing that, you're not disturbing the soil as much, you're not pulling plows through it, cultivators, so on and so forth, pressing it down afterwards, you're using less fuel. So you're able to reduce your fuel by 20, 30, 40%, depending on the system. And I suppose this is key to reduced cultivation systems. Some systems are very minimalist in terms of they just barely disturb the soil. Some are using cultivators where you're going in, and what we've seen in some cases over time is that those cultivators are working almost at plough depth just to get enough tilt in. So it depends on the system that you're using. One of the other big areas, I suppose, that tillage farmers are starting to become more sustainable in terms of our organic manures and use of organic manures in our crops. And even within that, I suppose there's been a huge change in terms of how they're using those organic manures. So I suppose if you look at the photograph there, you can see that in this case here, this is one of our signpost farmers. And actually he's won the Tillage Signpost Award last week. That was Tom Barry. And you can see here, he's putting actually slurry onto a winter barley crop as the crop is growing. So traditionally what would have happened years ago is that slurries would have been put on in the autumn time onto bare stubble because you didn't want to drive on the crop. And it was efficient, ground was dry, and it was an easy way of doing it. But I suppose the big danger with that was that crops didn't necessarily need a big amount of nutrition at that stage of the year. When you're coming into wintertime, all they need is just enough just to keep going and to survive the winter. And generally that's supplied from whatever nutrients are available in the soil. You don't need any excess nutrition going on to the crop. So Tom is looking at, Tom applied the slurry here in this case here. And as you can see in the photograph here, that barley crop is actually starting to go yellow. So really that's showing you that now the crop is starting to get into a nitrogen deficiency, and it actually needs that organic manures now. This was put on generally, I think, or he generally does it in March. So you can see there, the crop is coming into spring. That's when the big demand comes on winter barley. Winter barley, if you think from St. Patrick's Day to the 1st of May, generally grows about 2 feet tall, or a little bit over 2 feet tall. So it's a lot of growth in that period of time, and that's when you need your nitrogen on the crop. Not only to supply nitrogen and P and potassium, you're looking at supplying micronutrients as well. So all your micro elements as well can go in your organic manures as well. And as I said there, you can apply them now when the crop really needs them. And I suppose one of the big changes in that over the last number of years has been the switch, not only in tillage farms, but also in other farms as well, to low emission slurry spreading. And you can see there, they're using a dribble bar system on an umbilical system. So that's a very, very efficient way of getting crops or getting organic manures onto that barley crop and doing very, very little damage. You can barely see the wheel track there on that farm there. And over time, I suppose, maybe not with slurries, but certainly with farmyard manures and other organic manures like that, mushroom compost, layers manures, things like that, you will increase soil carbon and you will increase organic matter levels as well. So that's all good as well. In terms of fertilizer use, as I said already, we're probably top of the game in terms of nitrogen use efficiency. And as I said earlier on, we are applying it to crop demand. And one of the big changes, I suppose, that has happened over the last number of years has comes along with technology. And I'll come on to this again in a few minutes. And you can see a yield map or soil map there from a farm a number of years ago that we were working on as part of our Better Farm program. And you can see there's different maps and there's different rates that field there needs to get fertilizer on. So when you put that information into a GPS spreader, you can apply different rates of fertilizer onto that crop based on the crop demand. So that's a very efficient way of using nitrogen and fertilizers. And it also stops us over applying fertilizers, which again is a waste. And that variable rate spreading, I suppose, if you look at a lot of the fertilizer spreaders that's been bought over TAMS over the last number of years, that's a key part of what a lot of those fertilizer spreaders are now doing. So they're putting fertilizer where it's needed, when it's needed, and very little waste in terms of boundaries and things like that. So that's all good in terms of how we use our fertilizer. The one thing I suppose that is a kind of I won't say overplay, but is a benefit too, is this whole area of protected ureas. And I know there's been a lot of debate out there over the last number of years about protected ureas. And yes, they do play a role, albeit it's probably small in the tillage context, because we don't tend to get the same benefit from protected ureas as you do in other industries, because we tend to be on the lighter soils, so we have less emissions from urea and CAN. As I mentioned earlier on, precision ag is a big influence now on tillage farmers, and I suppose this is only becoming more and more important as technology improves as we go forward. I mean, this is kind of something that we see built into most machines now. So you have all this capability, whether it be on your combine harvester, whether it be on your fertilizer spreader, whether it be on your drill, your sprayer, whatever it happens to be. All this is there available to you. It's coming in the cost of the machines now. And I suppose more and more people starting to turn this on to try and reduce down the cost of what they're doing. As we know, the costs are rising all the time. And one way of combating that is to place them exactly where they're needed, when they're needed. So this all comes back to there's multi layers of precision agriculture system, not just driving in a straight line. And that's one thing I suppose people, certainly tillage farms, are very, very aware of in terms of auto steer and GPS positioning and all that type of thing. That's only one part of it. The other part of it is really about data recording, how you use that data, not just recording what has been done over the last number of years, but also using that data to make better decision making going into the future. So that's really where I suppose that waste element is. We're trying to reduce down that in terms of reducing down all this extra spend that's not needed based on the information there. And as you can see on the bottom photograph there, the sprayer coming in here to a headland where it turns off itself automatically because it knows using GPS signals that you don't need to put all that extra pesticide onto that headland, so it cuts down that waste. So that's something that, you can get, depending on the field size, depending on the width of the machine, you can make savings of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, which over a big area adds up to a lot. So that's something that's very, very that's very available to growers at the moment. As how we make best use of that is the challenge. A very topical one at the moment is the whole area straw cooperation. And I suppose this is something that came in on the MAC curve for tillage farmers, one of the key metrics in terms of reducing down our greenhouse gas emissions and our whole area of sequestering carbon. So instead of baling it and sending it off to animal farms and stuff like that, what we're doing is recycling it back into the soil immediately. And that's putting more carbon back into the soil. It's also recycling phosphorus and potassium. So, and that's a key one, as we would have seen when fertilizer prices went up or spiked in 2022. Buying P and K was very expensive. So, and a lot of farms where, maybe there isn't a big outlet for straw to be baled and sent to animal farms or mushroom farms, whatever it is, recycling it seemed to be an awful lot more efficient use of that straw. And we see over the last couple of years that 40 to 50,000 hectares is going into that every year now. So that's something I suppose that is very sustainable, and it's very, very easily done, albeit farmers are getting paid to do it. And the other thing, I suppose, it doesn't just recycle carbon and put things back into the soil. It does actually speed up the harvest. So really, if you're talking to guys who are actually working combine harvesters, it's so much easier to cut a crop when you don't have to, avoid straw at the ends and at the headlands and stuff like that. And you can move much faster through the crop, even though I suppose you are burning a little bit more diesel, but I suppose you're making a savings that you don't have to bale the straw and move the straw. So there's actually less fuel used there in an overall situation. Yes, the combine uses more, but the whole farm or harvest operation actually uses less. The other thing I suppose that we are seeing from that is when you're doing it over time. And interestingly, just talking to a tillage farmer yesterday who's doing it for a number of years now at this stage. And one of the key areas that he's looking at now is improving soil structure. So when you're putting this back on year after year after year, initially, I suppose the first year, you do get a change in that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it does actually upset the balance in the soil. But over time, it does improve, and you do improve the soil structure. So you get back, as the farmer said to me, almost kind of a lay type situation where it looks like you're working the ground after a grassland. And I suppose one of the other things that you're looking at there is you're feeding the soil organisms. So we're trying to be more aware of what's going on underneath the ground. And there's an awful lot of activity going on underneath the ground. So if we're able to apply or give feedstuffs to all the organisms, microorganisms, everything else that are in the soil, and that's only a positive thing too, because you get a more vibrant soil, a more active and alive soil. So that's all positive. And I suppose this is the key thing to it too. I suppose if I was to put a value on that straw going back into a field in any given year, if you're looking at a crop that's winter oats that they're chopping in that field there, I'd value that at somewhere around 370 euros a hectare, 150 euros an acre. That's what it's worth to me in terms of the nutrients going back in, the value that straw chopping scheme puts on it, but also the incidental cost of it as well. So the actual working and reducing compaction and all those sort of issues as well. So to me, anybody that's selling straw now, they need to be getting in the region of that sort of figure there for it to be viable. One of the big increases over the last number of years in sustainable practices or in tillage farms has been this whole area of cover crops and stubble cultivation. As we know, on a tillage side, we have to stubble cultivate to generate some sort of green material on the soil to reduce down the risk of leachate after harvest. And that's something I suppose is a change in practice over the last number of years. Like I said earlier, traditionally I'm looking at spring barley growers or spring crop growers, particularly sugar beet, where we used to plough before the winter and let that weather over winter break that land down. Because probably we didn't have the horsepower to break down soil like we do now, or the technology to do it. We do have that technology now. But I suppose what we found incidentally over time is that where we do protect the soil and when we do put cover crops on, soil is much easier to break down anyway. So it's a win-win, if you like. We're trapping nutrients, we're protecting the soil, and we are finding that where we do use cover crops now, soil is much easier work in the spring. So that's a real positive, apart from anything else that it's doing for the environment. As I said, it's protecting the soil. It's also preventing soil erosion, so we don't see soil movement. Excuse me, where we have cover crops on here, and that cover crop there is a mix of the likes of tillage radish, phacelia. So there's different species going in there. So we're not affecting the crop rotation, and that's one of the key things I suppose we have to be aware of when we are putting in cover crops, is that we're not bringing in diseases or weeds unnecessarily into our crops. So if you have something like an oilseed rape in the rotation, you would avoid like the brassica crops, putting them into the rotation, because you will bring diseases and other problems as well. As I say, it traps all the nutrients. So generally speaking, in a tillage situation, we see the greatest losses of nitrogen after harvest, and likewise with pea, where the ground is bare. If you're in a high risk pea loss soil, say some of those heavier soils, you tend to get most of those losses after harvest, where you get rainfall on the soil moves, and you get runoff of those fine pea particles into watercourses. And likewise with nitrogen, there's nothing there to take up that residual nitrogen that's left behind after the crop. So if you get a lot of rain, that nitrate leaches out, especially on sandy soils like we have here along the Barrow Valley and the Slaney and the Nore. You get a lot of nitrogen being leached out of soils at that stage into groundwater, and it ends up in estuaries. So that's something we have to be very, very careful of. And also, I suppose, what it has generated, and this is something that has changed over the last number of years in terms of people's attitude, it has presented tillage farmers with an extra income where they can set that land for livestock to graze. So where it's suitable. So that's something that I mentioned, financial sustainability already. That's a win-win again for that farmer if you're able to do that you can actually put in a cover crop, trap all the nitrogens, improve your soil structure, and potentially actually get a small income from grazing animals on it as well. In terms of weed control, it is also a key component of weed control, where you stubble cultivate and you get some of those weed seeds growing, particularly volunteer cereals or other things like that. You can actually help to reduce down that pressure on you. And likewise with pest control as well. 2023 was a bad year for, say, like the slugs. So slugs, like a wet soil, where you stubble cultivate that soil and you turn up that soil a little bit, you do expose the slug eggs and the slugs themselves to predators. So that's something that can be useful as well. Number 7, again, has been a change over the last couple of years and the last couple of seasons, I think, if you like. But it's also being rewarded in the likes of acre schemes and the GLOS scheme before that. That's the whole area of boundaries and field boundaries and margins. And I think this is something that, again, tillage farmers, not all of them, but increasingly they're becoming more and more and more aware of this. And I suppose, again, it brings a couple of different challenges to farmers in terms of how they grow their crops. So I suppose the first place we look at, if you look at the bottom picture there, is in terms of protecting water course and water features. So that's a river there, and there's a margin there, there's a grass margin there, and the crop is in the background. So the crop is nowhere near the river here. So in terms of applying fertilizer, in terms of applying pesticides, we're seeing more and more of a challenge now with pesticides and bigger buffer zones being applied to new pesticides when they arrive on the market. So that's something that's a challenge that tillage farmers are going to have to be aware of. If you look at even the new clover safe product there's a 20-meter buffer zone on that. So you can apply that product unless you have low drift nozzles, even on a grassland situation, within 20 meters of that if you're using flat fan nozzles. So you need to use reduce drift nozzles on that to reduce down your margin, your buffer. So in that case there, that farmer is taking that issue out of his farm, so he doesn't have to worry about it. Okay. The other one there, I suppose, is we're trying to encourage biodiversity. And the top picture is a scheme that a couple of farmers in the Kildare area got into, called the Kildare Pollinator Plan. So you can see there the margin there with the oxeye daisy and full flower beside the spring barley. And again, that's something that's encouraging pollinators. And I was in that field a couple of years ago, and it was amazing to see all the different wildlife and activity that was in that, in terms of bees, in terms of wasps, in terms of whatever you like to see. And also you'll see more activity from overland mammals like badgers and foxes and things like that too, even though they might be the bane of some people's lives. But again, we have to be cognizant of that. And in that case there, you can see that farmer there is letting a couple of trees up in the hedgerow as well. So that's all a positive for the environment and for biodiversity. You're sequestering carbon, you're supplying food, and you're also protecting some of the wildlife as well. So you're providing cover for them as well. So that hedgerow management and field boundary margin, I think, is something that we're going to see more and more of as we get into it. We see it in the UK now, where farmers are taking out fields and fields and fields, putting them into these wild bird mixes, and they're not growing crops in them at all. Don't think that's necessarily where we need to go, but I think if we're a bit more cognizant of how we grow our margins here and how we protect those margins, I think there's a win-win for both the environment and for the tillage farmer as well. Land management, again, I suppose, this is something that we do and don't even really think about it in terms of how we grow our crops. So I suppose one of the big things here we've done for years and years and years in Ireland, and it's probably not as practiced in other countries. Certainly been talking to other advisors from other countries where, you know, monocrops seem to be more the standard. In Ireland, we tend to grow more rotational crops. So again, from a crop rotation point of view, it has a lot of benefits in terms of reducing weed pressure, reduces disease pressure, and also reduces the amount of pesticides we need to use on crops, because you don't get, when you're changing from one crop to the other, you're reducing that pest and weed and disease burden. Again, I suppose where you're looking at it, reduces waste, it reduces the labor part of the business as well. So you spread out your workload over a long period of time. You don't tend to get these peaks and troughs. And again, I suppose if you're not rushing around at growing crops when you shouldn't be growing them, helps reduce likes of compaction, soil compaction, and things like that too. So you can help to protect your soil like that. And in the case of what we have here, you can see two pictures there of legumes there. They're field beans. Beans and peas will produce nitrogen themselves. They will take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into nitrogen in the soil. So that's all a positive there. And the bottom photograph there, you can see the bee here actually feeding away on a flower. So that's a very positive move in terms of where we are in tillage farming. Soil management, I suppose, is slightly different in terms of how I'm thinking of soil management. And again, we're very good in this in the tillage industry, probably better than any of the other disciplines out there. I've been working in dairying and beef a long time ago. And generally speaking, tillage farmers, again, because there's a harvest every year, they know the results of their actions on an ongoing basis. They tend to test the soil and look after the soil better from that point of view. So regular soil testing is carried out on most tillage farms now. It's rare to see a field that hasn't got, and I know even before the regulations come in, it's rare to see a field that hasn't got a relatively recent soil test. By recent, I mean within the last 4 to 5 years. And I know that's even changing even more, where a lot of farmers now are talking and doing it either on a yearly basis or on a bi-yearly basis. So that's, again, something that's it gives you more information, and it helps you to manage the soil that bit better. Liming, I suppose, is something that, again, that tillage farmers tend to be very active on in terms of, you know, putting out lime. Again, it's the cheapest form of fertilizer. It makes other nutrients more available in the soil. So again, I suppose if you're looking at where tillage farmers are, if you're getting a poor crop, and they will identify this very, very early, if you've a very low pH soil and you're getting a lot of poor crops, it is economic to put out lime. And I suppose one of the things that we're trying to do over the next number of years, and have been trying to get farmers to do, is to look at not just the mineral aspect of the soil, but also the soil components itself. So looking at soil assessments there. So you can see the photograph down there in the bottom right-hand corner, where our new soil specialist, Veronica Nyhan, is actually assessing the soil to see, are there compaction layers in it? And if there are, how do we deal with those? So that's, again, in trying to assess the soil, reduce down compaction levels. And I suppose over time, if we can increase our organic matter levels, that will help to protect our soils as well. So that's, again, a very positive from our emissions and our sustainability point of view. And the last one, then, I suppose, I came up with 10 points I think that tillage farmers can do. And one of the areas, I suppose, that isn't talked about much in terms of tillage farms, because we tend to work on the better farms, is the whole area of agroforestry. And again, I suppose there are all the benefits from growing trees in terms of sequestering carbon, in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But I think in a tillage situation, it's something that we can look at. And this is the picture here is from one of our Signpost farmers. And you can see the areas that he's planted there. And they tend to be the lower areas of the farm, slopey areas, maybe the areas that don't yield terribly well. And he's put in a 5-hectare block here of forestry in here. And I suppose that's something that, in a tillage situation, if you have land that's suitable for that, it can certainly help you to get to carbon and zero. And I suppose that's something that, again, maybe not an option on every farm, but certainly there are farms out there who are looking at it more and more, because one of the things I think that tillage farmers are starting to become more aware of now is their overall yields and the financial impact of low yields on crops. If we have low yields, we are losing money. So I think more and more farmers are taking measures now to put in areas like this, whereby your low yielding areas, if you take them out, you'll actually increase profitability. And that's something that I suppose that's becoming more and more important. I mentioned financial sustainability earlier on, and this is something that we can actually do as well to help that. And I suppose the final point there is where you take out those wet areas or those areas that are low-lying or slopey areas, you do help prevent leaching. So you stop those nutrients, that nutrient loss into groundwater and into water courses. So that's about all I have for you, Mark. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Shay, and thanks for keeping the time. There are some really nice, clear points there. Your 10-point plan. You'd swear there's an election coming up, Shay. So look, you touched there on the financial sustainability side of things, and just if we could deal with that now before we maybe get into the environmental sustainability side of things. Where is the sector at in relation to financial sustainability, Shay? Because it is very hard to be. They say it's very hard to be green if you're in the red. There's a famous saying that's been developed now recently. But where is the sector in terms of sustainability from a financial point of view? And look, we've seen a lot of emphasis on little flashes of how important tillage is, and that we need to be more self-sufficient from a tillage perspective. However, the Ukrainian crisis, COVID, are quickly forgotten. Those types of the global impact of those changes or geopolitical changes that happen.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Mark, because I suppose traditionally, if you look at them, I started off with National Farm Survey data, and if you look at the National Farm Survey over the last number of years, dairying has always been the most profitable, if you like, financially sustainable sector that we have here. And in the second place, albeit a distant second place, is tillage, which tends to be ahead of both dry stock and cattle and sheep. But at the same time, the last couple of years have been very, very challenging. If you take we carry out an audit every year for CSO, looking at the yields that farmers get, and our profit is primarily based down to yield. So where you have a low yielding year like we had in 2023, profitability suffers. So last year, I think the average tillage farmer in that National Farm Survey made something like 20-something odd thousand euros per farm. So that's not ideal. And I suppose that's something that all tillage farmers are challenging now. So they are looking at ways, like I mentioned earlier on, of reducing down their input costs. So like the likes of the GPS, likes of precision ag, all those tools, the reduced cultivations, all those tools are being used to try and combat the challenges in terms of financial sustainability, albeit they're long-term goals rather than short-term fixes, So, well, it certainly is a challenge.
I observed, maybe you did use the word regenerative agriculture. I don't think I heard you say it, but a lot of what you were talking about is part of that. What in your view, what is the difference? Or
I suppose regenerative agriculture, if you like, there are a number of strands to it. It's not one single thing, and I think this is where a lot of people kind of get confused, and a lot of argument and debate goes on all the time about regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture is a system. It's not suitable for every farm, and every farm's goal is probably similar in terms of reducing down their impact on the environment, reducing down their impact on soils, particularly in a tillage situation where you're not impacting the soil as much as you possibly can. But I think it's a challenge for every farm. And I think I look at it in terms of good farming practice. It's a term that's put on, to my mind, just general good farming practice, like all the measures I've mentioned here earlier on. That, to me, if you like, encapsulates regenerative farming to one degree, but it is generally good farm practice. And I think that's something that, it kind of gets lost in the debate or the argument, whichever you like to say sometimes, that regenerative farming really is about protecting the soil, protecting the environment. And how you do that can be specific to your farm. It mightn't be the same in Cork as it is in Donegal. There's two different challenges there. And likewise in Wexford. So it's how you best adapt to reduce down your impact, because we all have an impact. No matter what we do, we've all an impact on the environment. So it's how you reduce down your own impact on carbon footprint, or whatever you want to call it, in your own scenario or your own situation. That, to me, is what regenerative farming is all about.
Okay, and just a reminder to everyone, we have a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Please do send us your questions or comments. Shay, lots coming through there. Or, sorry, Cathal.
Yeah, lots of questions, Mark. And just when you're touching on regenerative agriculture, you're after ticking the box for a lot of the stuff they're looking for. Particularly, there's a real famous guy called Gabe Brown, and he talks about a lot of what you discussed. But there's two other things. Just somebody's asking a question on the profitability of no-till cropping and multi-cropping. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I suppose we actually are doing a survey on that at the moment. We've a master's student working on that at the moment called Jack Jemison, and he's looking at the profitability of no-till systems versus plow-till systems. And I suppose again, in an Irish context, I mean, the risks are generally higher in terms of weather risks. If you take last year, for example, in 2023, a lot of the no-till systems, when you got into October, when we traditionally drill our winter series, just didn't work because the soil was too wet. Whereas plough systems tend to be a little bit more forgiving, albeit they're more expensive. So I'm not going to predict what Jack is going to see or going to produce over the next couple of months in terms of his thesis, but generally speaking, as a general rule of thumb, regenerative farmers or no-till systems or reduced cultivation systems tend to spend less money on inputs, so they can actually afford lower yields if they get lower yields. And in some cases they do, and some cases they don't. But I suppose in an Irish context, we're in a really wet climate, plough-based systems tend to be that little bit more forgiving, albeit they may not be more profitable in some scenarios. So it's kind of, there's no one solution fits all, I think, and that's the key thing about no-till systems. Like some guys now are on direct drill systems where they direct drill straight into the stubbles, and some guys are doing some sort of minimum cultivation, like to run, say, a cultivator through the soil just to get a bit of tilt there. And there are different challenges. You're looking at different ground conditions. You tend to be working earlier in drier climates or drier soils, and that can create a problem this time of year. So if you were working earlier, you're drilling in September, that tends to lead you to more problems with like grass weeds, with likes of barley and dwarf fires in winter barley, where you have aphids moving at warmer temperatures. So you tend to have more risk at that. But the converse of it is if you go later, you could have different problems as well. So there's no one solution fits all. There's no perfect solution. And I think that's the key to it. Some people are very adamant and gets into great debates and great arguments at times about which system is right. There's no one system suits all. And I think that's key.
Yeah, I'm going to really put you on the spot now, but there's a GAIAC 7 rule that has an exemption from crop rotation for barley, where the farmers between 10 and 50 hectares. And I suppose the question there is that encouraging continuous cropping of barley, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I've mentioned financial sustainability, right? And I think this is something that gets mixed up in the whole debate, or gets lost in the whole debate. That's a particular circumstance that you're talking about, Cathal, really, and that's really down to malt and barley growers, right? So if we look at malt and barley growers in Wexford, for argument's sake, it's probably the most profitable crop that those growers can grow on an ongoing basis, year in, year out. So yes, you might argue that, listen, those crops aren't, it's not great to be putting in the same crop every year, year on year. But within that GAIAC 7, you have to put in a cover crop. So you are actually putting in a cover crop there to meet some of that, or to reduce down your impact or meet some of those sustainability criteria. So from that point of view, there's two elements to it. Yes, it's not ideal, but It's more nuanced than people actually think. And there's as I said, there's that financial sustainability element to it too that we all have to strive for as well.
You mentioned, Shay, in your presentation, the benefits of incorporating organic manures into tillage systems. Do you think there's greater opportunities there for more cooperation between livestock farmers and tillage farmers, or do you see any changes happening there?
Without a shadow of a doubt, Mark, I think it's something that is going on at the moment, albeit it needs to be a lot more of it. Definitely, I suppose where the nitrates derogation is coming under pressure, I think this is an easy win for the livestock sector. A lot of tillage farms, a lot of tillage soils are deficient, as we say, in organic matter, and to me, it's a no-brainer if you can. And there are if you can do it, and we see a lot. I won't say a lot, but we see some elements of a straw for slurry or straw for farm manure swap. I mean, that's only good on both sides, you know. So I would think certainly there is capacity out there, and it's something that we'll be looking at more in the future.
Okay. And have you seen any good examples of how that's working, or any interesting
Well, the
models?
farm I showed you earlier on there, the sustainability of the year, the Tillage Sustainable Farm of the Year is a fellow by the name of Tom Barry down in Cork, and that's what he's doing. That slurry he gets comes from pig units and from dairy units. So he doesn't produce that. He's put in a slurry tank on his farm, and as you can see there in that photograph, he's putting out pig slurry in that case, I think, on winter barley. And I mean, that's again, you're getting rid of a waste product from one sector, but it's a very beneficial product in the tillage sector. So again, it's a double win, if you like, for both sides.
We don't call it a waste product anymore, Shay.
Some people still, and it's actually something that I think we kind of have to get around. You're 100% correct, Mark. Some farmers still see it as a waste product, and we spread it when we shouldn't be spreading it. I think it's a very, very valuable source of nutrients. It's like 10-10-20. I'd be putting out 10-10-20 when the crop needs it, not when they have to, you know. So
Yeah.
Shay, there's a good few questions around catch crops, and people are very interested, obviously. But there's one specific one about maybe incorporating legumes into the catch crops.
Yeah.
And that's one part of it, but then come away from the catch crops and just look at maybe leguminous crops as a normal crop. And I suppose you mentioned some of the issues we have with nitrate leaching in some parts of particularly the southeast.
Yeah, so if we take the catch crop ones first and putting legumes into catch crops, again, I suppose they are approved under, say, the likes of acre schemes and things like that. To me, putting them into a catch crop doesn't make a huge amount of sense, to be perfectly honest, because you're putting them in the autumn time where you don't get a whole lot of growth. You don't tend to get that much nitrogen from them. And work Richie Hackett would have done here in Oak Park shows that unless you put them in kind of in late July, early August, and you don't go near them again until maybe April time, you don't actually get that much benefit from them. But again, I suppose, look at whatever little bit you can get. The other point about that is they don't soak up any nitrogen. So whatever nitrogen is in the ground, they don't take it up. It's the other crops that you have in the catch crop mix that take them up. But in general terms, in terms of proteins or leguminous crops in general, I mean, if you look at the CAP strategy over the last number of years, and I showed figures there about soya coming from South America and GM soya, and that's a bane of contention with a lot of tillage farmers at the moment, how we're allowed to bring in GM soya and feed Irish animals and still say they're grass fed, if you like. If we can produce native proteins in Europe, and I think this is where policy is going, if we can produce more native proteins, be it beans, peas, lupins, whatever it is, you're getting a native protein, but also you're putting more nitrogen back into the soil, which reduces down the amount of chemical fertilizer we have to put on the following crop and on that crop as well, because legumes don't need nitrogen. So that's a win-win, if you like, for the tillage sector and for the sector as a whole.
Yeah, and just on that as well, I would stick with the cover crops a little bit. How are tillage farmers getting on with the 3 hectare stubble layback for every 7 hectares?
Yeah, it's challenging. There's no doubt about it. And I know of a couple of farms that have stopped taking in animals on the basis of it, because sometimes the farms are fragmented and you don't necessarily have a 3 hectare field to put beside a 7 hectare field to qualify. So it is certainly a challenge. The guys that are still doing it generally are more mixed farms, who have a bit of grassland or something like that, and they can put in, a lie-back for them. But it certainly is becoming a challenge. Now, that said, there is, within the GAIAC rules as well, there is that compulsion where you have to leave 20% of your land idle anyway over the summer for grass or for ground nesting birds. So they are getting their heads around this idea of not stubble cultivating a certain amount of ground. That said, it is a challenge for a lot of them, and I do see a drop off of farmers making their land available to graze cover crops, which is unfortunate,
Mm-hmm. And the placement of those winter feeding crops is probably important as well. You mentioned a bit about sediment and pea loss.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, you have to choose your fields that are suitable to graze. So if you have a low-lying field that's beside a river and it's at risk of getting flooding every year, point is putting in a catch crop into that area and expecting animals to go in and graze it. You can put in a catch crop by all manner of means, but I would avoid grazing that. So again, pick your fields, pick dry fields, high fields, whatever it happens to be, fields with a natural run back beside them. They're the fields I will be selecting when I'm putting in cover crops if I'm going to decide to graze them.
Yeah, we have a question here in relation to the use of glyphosate there when spraying crops off pre-harvest while still avoiding ploughing. Is there a concern there around biodiversity and food safety?
Yeah, well, I suppose the rules have changed on that, Mark, in terms of the glyphosate got an extension of use for the next 10 years last year. And those rules around burning off crops pre-harvest have all changed now. So for the most part, it's a practice that few farmers do anymore, if any. And again, looking at some of the quality markets like malt and barley, those markets, they don't allow it in the contract full stop. So I suppose it is a practice that was ongoing a number of years ago, but very, very few farms, unless you have a very, very bad weed problem in something like oilseed rape or some of those feed cereals, unless you have a very, very bad weed problem, people can actually do it. But we generally, in 99% of cases, they avoid it.
And are there alternatives to that practice?
No, there isn't really. If you have a very grassy stubble or something like that coming into harvest, there's nothing you can do. Nothing you can do. So
I suppose it leads me on to a broader question around the increased pressure, downward pressure on the use of chemicals within agriculture in general. Yeah. I know that is presenting its own challenges for the tillage sector. What's your view on that, Shay? And
yeah, it is. Certainly it's become, I won't say a problem, it's become a challenge. And I think what we've done over the last 30 or 40 years, since pesticides have become more involved or important in farming systems, is that we've become reliant on them. And what we're seeing now is that farmers are relearning, if you like, how to solve problems without using a can. And there are ongoing projects here where I'm involved in a couple of projects called involving IPM, called IPM Works, where we're looking at tools and methods and ways of avoiding problems and detecting problems and solving problems without using a can. So I think that is a movement that's this movement towards using less plant protection products. That's not going to change. That's the direction of travel where we're going. That said, there are a couple of issues that, and as you said earlier on, I'm a potato specialist. Well, if you take blight as an example, that's one area where it's becoming a huge challenge to try and reduce down our pesticide load on those crops, because blight is such a devastating disease that if it gets into a crop, it's almost impossible to stop it. But that said, it's an isolated problem. There are other problems like weeds and stuff like grass weeds. One of the very good successes we had, if you like, with grass weeds in that ECT project that's finished last year was putting in buffer margins. So using buffer margins around your hedgerows to stop sterile brome encroaching into your crops. So that's a practice now that many farmers who have a sterile problem are doing now, and it's solving that problem without the use of any pesticides. So it can be done. It's just a matter of actually knowing the problem and knowing how to do it.
See those nature-based solutions being used and having impact.
Exactly.
Yep. So Jay, just on that again, so you mentioned about min-till and the different types of till and the plough. Is the plough going to disappear from the farmyard?
No, I can't see it anytime soon, Cathal. If you think of it, I mean, the plough serves a lot of purposes. And if you like, talking about IPM, it was probably the first IPM tool that was ever invented in terms of you're turning down your weeds and you're giving your crop a clean start when you're drilling them. That said, it is expensive, and there are all the other problems with in terms of carbon release and so on and so forth. But I suppose if you look at it in terms of weed control and what can actually do, there are areas where you will need it, and in terms of drainage as well. Like, I mean, you create a drain for soakage. Be it you can do damage if you're ploughing in the wrong conditions too. But I can't see a plough disappearing anytime soon, especially in an Irish context. It's probably, if you take it, I won't say it's the most reliable, but it's probably, and I won't say foolproof, but it does give you a lot more scope in terms of putting in crops in less than ideal conditions.
Yeah, and we've a number of questions around, I suppose, nitrate leaching and in tillage areas, particularly around southeast, and just kind of a couple of comments, and I'll band them all together. But there was one that you kind of presented, which is correct, that tillage has a really good nutrient use efficiency, and they're kind of wondering why we're still getting nitrate losses on this region. And then there's another kind of question around maybe the use of sulfur. Shay, you might comment on it for reducing nitrate.
Yeah, so it's a good comment about the nitrate leaching, and I suppose we talked about, we were out looking at those soils in Wexford and Ballycarney and all down along Slaney a number of years ago. And one of the points that I think people forget about is that soil is releasing nitrogen all the time. So you get natural release of nitrogen. So even if you never put out a bag of nitrogen, and if you grew a crop and left the stubble idle after harvest, if that crop never got nitrogen, you're still releasing nitrogen. So that's just a function of the soil. They are in that area tend to be the sandier soils, really leaky soils. So anything that you apply on the crop can get washed through very, very quickly. And that's the same with pesticides as well. If you're putting out pesticides in those crops, they can get washed through very, very quickly. And not quickly, but they can get washed through. So in that case, I suppose if you're looking at those soils, that's a function of those soils. So again, whether we look at reducing down the amount of nitrogen that's going to be available on those crops, I don't know. That's probably a policy decision. It'll be creating a lot of problems, I think, if we do that, because obviously then you're going to reduce down your yields. So I suppose that's an issue down there. In terms of sulfur, yeah, and again, I'm thinking back when we went through college years and years and years ago, sulfur was an element that we didn't talk about too much, except on really sandy soils, and that sandy soils tend to be deficient in sulfur. And it was an element that made nitrogen and everything else more efficiently used in the crop. Tends to be used more now across crops for that efficiency factor, that it helps other elements be more efficient and be taken up more efficiently by the crops. So again, I suppose you see, if you look at a lot of fertilizers now, there's always 4 or 5, maybe even 6% sulfur in a lot of those. And that's to have the efficiency of the other elements being used.
Shay, we have a little, I call it a little nudge from one of our colleagues. He's asking, is there a list of actions that tillage farmers can implement to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? Without listing them off, maybe you could
I would think
signpost people where to go.
Yeah, so the signpost guys are good in this. So obviously, straw chopping would be one, cover crops would be another, reduce cultivations. And the last one I mentioned there, which is agroforestry, if we have put and implement some of those around farms, that's probably the quickest way to get into carbon zero or net zero, if we like, on the tillage farm. And I suppose that's the one thing, Mark, about that, when you're asked about a nudge, tillage farmers are probably closer at meeting those targets than anybody else.
Yes. No, it's fantastic, the work that's going on there, and how progressive the whole sector is. I think it's always been noted. I think we're just coming up on time. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for more questions. But thank you to everybody who submitted their questions and comments this morning. Shay, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us this morning. Really enjoyed your presentation. Cathal, thanks so much for helping with the questions. Next week, we're going to be joined by Dr. Kevin Kilcline, who's going to be talking about growing resilient organic farming systems. It's a project that he's project leading at the moment, and it looks like he's going to be sharing a lot of insights around that project and its aims, objectives, and all, some of the outputs from that project. So do tune into us next Friday at 9:30. Until then, have a nice weekend, and hopefully we'll have a little bit dry weather. The dry weather will continue. Thanks again.